Thank you all for coming along today. And for those of you that don't know me, I'm George Gawley, and I'm from the Farm Advisory Service, but I work in St. Boswell's here, and this is our second Women in Ag meeting this year. So I'd just like to welcome you all along today. And yeah, one of the aims of today's meeting is to try and understand a bit more about on-farm tree planting. And if anyone has recently read the 1.5 degrees roadmap to 2045 produced by NFUS and Nourish Scotland, it's quite clear that the correct trees in the correct places have a big part to play in an integrated farm approach to reducing emissions going forward, while at the same time allowing us to ensure our food security and biodiversity going forward. So today my aim was really just to try to summarize some of the woodland options that are available, and things that might or might not work on our own farms. So the other aim of today's meeting is to try and understand a wee bit more about carbon credits. Now, if you're like me, you'll be aware that carbon trading is happening, but perhaps have struggled to keep up with it. And it's quite often associated with these big private investors coming in and buying up sort of large areas of farm ground for tree planting. But I just wanted to know, and I think a lot of folk out there want to know, is this something that we as farmers should be thinking about? And is this something that can work alongside new tree planting on sort of more marginal areas of ground, or even on shelter belts, which we know can have other advantages, such as shielding livestock and reducing emissions. So it's really just to try and get a summary of what's out there and what might work for us. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome along Ben. Ben is our guest this afternoon, and he's a senior forestry consultant for SAC, and he's based up in Inverness. And Ben, thank you for joining us today. Would you just like to maybe start by telling us a wee bit about yourself and some of the work you're currently involved with?
George, thanks, for the introduction, and thank you to everyone who's made the time today to come along and join us. Wee bit about me. I'm the senior forestry consultant and team leader for the SAC Consulting's Woodlands team. We have offices across all of Scotland and a number of consultants who are delivering all manner of woodland management to clients, both little and large. We're dealing with woodland creation, harvesting, management of existing woodlands, maintenance as well, and everything else that you can possibly think within the woodland sector. So it's a very busy year for us just now. I'm delighted to talk to you more about what woodlands can offer for your farms. We'll just see if we can get the slideshow up on the page there. Hey, George, are you able to see that?
Yeah, that's worked for me. Okay, Ben. Yeah.
Brilliant. So we'll run through today, and I'll try and make this as whistle stop as I can, a brief tour of forestry and carbon sales, as it were, and we'll try and make it as relevant as we possibly can as well for the Borders area. As George has highlighted, I'm based in the Black Isle myself. My patch, as it were, I cover everything from Mulligan-Tyre across to Montrose and everything north, but we do have consultants covering the lower areas as well. So we'll cover these main topics today, and should any questions arise, as George has highlighted, please just raise your hand or ask the question. Happy to answer them. There will be a space for questions at the end as well. So why plant trees? Traditionally, trees were normally planted in farms to supplement income. Now that was done in terms of timber income, for firewood production, and for shelter as well on farms. But the benefits that trees can offer are many and diverse. Obviously, we've got the income potential there, timber prices just now are very much a high. We're seeing a very strong year for timber. And that's down to growing global demand and a bit of a shortage as well within the market. But we're also seeing very strong grant support as well for woodland creation, supported by the Scottish Government, with policy backing there. We're also seeing a number of other diverse benefits as well that forestry can offer farms. Now that could well be the timber aspect in terms of commercial timber with a thinning and clear fell regime. It could be firewood. It could well be the shelter for livestock and crops. It could be for biodiversity reasons. You could be planting trees for flood prevention or for biosecurity to separate fields between agricultural holdings. You could well be using forestry for management of pasture systems, for windbreaks, and for screening as well. So there's any number of reasons to plant trees, and we're going to talk to you today about how to do so, as it were. So what support is available is normally the key question. Planting trees is all very good, but it has to wash its own face. And this is one of the things that we find is the biggest challenge in forestry, certainly has been in recent years. So what support is available within the market at present? The main source of support for tree planting in Scotland as we speak is the Forestry Grant Scheme. We'll go on to that in a little bit in more detail, but essentially that is a scheme supported by Scottish Government through the rural payment system, and it incentivises landowners, farmers, crofters to plant trees on their property and to increase Scotland's forestry cover and work towards those forestry cover targets that we're working towards for 2024 and beyond. Part of the Forestry Grant Scheme, there are a number of models beneath that. Again, we'll explore those further in a little bit. But one of those that's a new addition is the Small Woodlands Loan Scheme. This is a loan scheme that forms part of the Forestry Grant, and it releases some of the capital from your grant up front, as it were. So woodland creation's not a particularly cheap operation to undertake. It's not one to undertake lightly, and there will be cash flow requirements in terms of paying for contractors and paying for work a good couple of months before the grants start paying out. And where this Small Woodlands Loan Scheme comes in is it bridges that gap. It will release some of your grant funding early in the process, which reduces the reliance on, for example, overdraft facilities, business loans, etc., to make projects possible. So we'll explore that more in a little bit. We've also got other funds there available. Some of these are new. You may have heard of these before. Some of them may be new to you. Some of them are certainly new to me a couple of weeks ago. We've got the Future Woodlands Fund. Now this is £2 million of funding from BP, of all people, funding woodland creation in the UK. And this is a grant scheme that provides funding for the full costs for a forestry grant scheme application, as well as a woodland carbon code project design document. We'll go into that further later, plus area payments of £100 per hectare per year for 20 years. So this is quite attractive for small landowners, those looking to create woodlands, but not able to fund the initial costs up front themselves. We've also got other schemes in there as well. You've got the Woodland Trust More Wood Scheme. Again, funds some, if not all, of a woodland creation for specific projects. They all have their own requirements though. There are area-specific schemes, such as the Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park Tree Planting Grant Scheme. Quite a mouthful. Again, clues in the title, it's specific for Loch Lomond and Trossachs. You also have, more relevant to this group, the South of Scotland Tree Planting Grant Scheme. And this is eligible for Dumfries and Galloway and also for the Scottish Borders. You'll find more details of that in this month's Unearthed publication and the Tweed Forum and other places online as well. We'll also send out links on this later as well in the summary of the presentation. Last two available that I'll run over quickly just now. The carbon credit funding we'll explore later. That's the main purpose of this talk. But the Train Hugger grant is a new one as well that's recently released. This is funding of 50p per tree for projects between 5,000 and 20,000 trees. It doesn't support maintenance or ancillary costs such as fencing or labour, so it's very good for self-starters and those who want to plant their own trees in their own properties. But again, scaled for smaller properties and smaller projects. So the Forestry Grant Scheme, we will touch on these rates very briefly. It is a complicated behemoth of a scheme. There are 9 different models within this and various different options within here as well. So the main options you will find are highlighted here in this table, the 5 options we have here. Conifer, which is your standard Sitka spruce plantation, which you'll see much of across Scotland, is a main productive crop that we grow. Diverse conifer, which could be softer species such as Douglas fir, Scots pine, larch, Norway spruce, and others. Broadleafs, which is more specifically referring to productive broadleaves, so oak, ash, cherry, gean, and others. Small or farm woodlands, which again is a specific model set up for small farmland woodland plantations, and has its own requirements there amongst others. And the native broadleaves option as well, which is more targeted for native woodland creations, which is suited to the site. That could be native upland birch, it could be wetland, alder and willow plantations, or anything else in between. Now, the way these grant payments are laid out, we've got payment rates for standard areas and payment rates for target areas. For standard areas and target areas, the payment structure is much the same. It's just there is a slight uplift in price for target areas. And these standard rates and target areas can be found within the Scottish Forestry website with maps showing where these apply. So with the standard format for the forestry grant scheme for these models, there is an initial planting payment, and that is done on a hectare's rate. And so for native broadleaves, this would be in the region of £1,840 for a standard area. And then for the target area, £2,070. On top of your initial planting payment, which is made in year one, you then get 5 years of maintenance payments, which are paid and claimed via your SAF form, your SAF return each year in the spring. And this is for native broadleaves, for example, £272 a year or £306 per year in target areas. So your gross value, so your year one payment combined with your 5 years maintenance for native broadleaves again would be £3,200 per hectare and £3,600 per hectare for target areas. These models vary. They have all got their own criteria for eligibility and for minimum scheme size, as well as species composition as well. The grant scheme will fund tree planting. It also funds capital items, and we'll move on to those next. Capital items under the forestry grant scheme, these include stock fencing, deer fencing, and these rates could vary depending if you're standard or high cost area. Again, depends on your topography and the access of your site. This also includes rabbit proofing of new or existing fencing, tree shelters, which can include trolley tubes, easy wraps and other spirals as well, vole guards, gates for stock or deer fencing, self-closing gates as well for pedestrian access, and very much of interest at present for a lot of our landowners now, bracken control and gorse removal. Now, this is not for the farm wide, this is only for areas where you're considering doing tree planting. And what this grant in particular is relevant for is areas where you have, for example, field margins, areas of fields of rough grazing where perhaps gorse has moved in and started to colonize the site, areas that are not particularly in full production at present, and that may be down to bracken, gorse, or other reasons. And these payments under the capital item scheme means you are supported for the operation of, for example, flail removing of gorse to enable tree planting in these areas which are otherwise at present unproductive. So a fantastic opportunity to look at areas of rough ground, perhaps areas that have been underutilized at present, and see if there is a way to one, reclaim these and bring these back into active use, but also to move them across into forestry. So that's a very, very brief whistle-stop tour of the forestry grant scheme. It is a complex scheme. There are a number of sections within there that require further attention, and a lot of these may be site-specific. In forestry, there are a huge number of variables, and that's something you have to learn to come to terms with when you're designing woodland creation, but also when you're managing it. So what works? For forestry grant schemes at present, the cost of woodland operations are rising. This is a result of, unfortunately, Brexit pressures, but also global supply chains and rising cost of labor. So we are seeing woodland creation operation costs, as well as other operation costs, rising, and the grant rates at present don't reflect this. So when you are considering woodland creation, be prepared to adapt your initial concept to better fit the grant model that you are targeting. Each grant model has its own requirements. If you can be flexible and adapt yours to better suit those requirements in terms of your design, so much the better, it's far more likely to work. There are, as I mentioned previously, a huge number of variables in woodland creation. Work with what you have on your site. You may have areas of peat, you may have areas of gorse, when wet areas of sites, riparian zones. You may have rough ground already. You may even have existing woodland areas. Incorporate these into your design. Don't try to change the site to fit the tree. Fit the trees to the site. And this is the easiest way to make sure you do not have excessive costs for maintenance or beat up costs at later years. Due to the way the forestry grant scheme model works at present, and this is on a linear meterage rate basis or on an area rate basis, schemes are most efficient when there are limited fencing and ancillary costs, such as deerstalk fencing, tree tubes, etc., and the maximum planting area available, as it were, within the scheme. If you can rationalize your design in such a way that you can increase your planting area whilst reducing your fencing costs, your scheme is far more likely to be an economic success. It may well be that you are considering shelter belt schemes. For a shelter belt under the forestry grant scheme, the minimum width you will need to plant is 20 meters from fence to fence in width. Minimum area is in the region of 0.5 hectare to 2 hectares, depending on which model. Although again, the larger the scheme, the better the economy of scale. So the more likely to have success you are. If, for example, you're looking at shelter belts, if you round the corners off, if you expand the edges slightly, so even if you have 20 meters for the main field boundary, and you expand on the corner slightly to 30, then you increase your planting area for very little increase in fencing length, and your scheme will likely be far more efficient on the grant system and far more likely to succeed economically. Economy of scale we've touched on there. The bigger the project is, the far more likely it is to perform stronger, financially and otherwise as well. For smaller, more complicated blocks, it is a challenge to make these work under the forestry grant scheme that we have at present. Unfortunately, the grant scheme we have is funded by public money, and the Scottish Forestry, the administrators, who used to be called Forestry Commission Scotland, they are looking for the biggest area of forestry they can deliver for the lowest investment of public capital. So the better economy of scale you can deliver, the far more likely your scheme is to score highly within their criteria. If you can, combine a number of forestry grant scheme models into your one design. Now, what I mean by this is you may well be looking at woodland creation on your property. You may well be looking at, for example, a 12-hectare field, which is currently rough grazing, that's been colonized by gores. It's underutilized. It may well have boggy ground within it that isn't particularly good for stock grazing. It may well be an area that is quite far flung on the farm, quite difficult to move livestock into and out of, or it may well have other issues such as winter poaching of margins or liver fluke. If you're looking at these designs, potentially combine forestry grant scheme models. You may have drier ground, more productive land within this area that could better suit commercial forestry, be that commercial conifer plantations or commercial broadleaf models. Combine these where you can with other models such as the native broadleaf schemes or the low density native woodlands, and this will allow you to maximize your grant support on your sites, but also to diversify your investment. If you're planting one block of commercial forestry and you're only doing commercial Sitka on it, it's going to stand out in the landscape. If you do a couple of models there, for example, native broadleafs around the edges, or you break up your block and incorporate commercial conifers there, diverse conifers, native broadleafs, low density native broadleafs, you not only diversify the forestry impact of the landscape, you also offer additional benefit to wildlife and also to the environment as well, and also to your investment. With the changing climate we have, there are far more diseases and pests within the UK affecting all crops, not just forestry, but agriculture as well. And by diversifying the species you're planting and the number you're planting within a design, you increase resilience there to pests, diseases, and future climate change as well. We touched briefly earlier on additional support. Capitalize on this where this is available. It may well be in your area there is additional support available, and that may well be the local and Trossachs scheme there. It may well be the schemes for train hugger grants. It may well be local authority schemes that are increasing the profile within creation, or it may well be local business support as well. And finally, with within creation, it is a long process in order to design a scheme to fit sympathetically with your business aims and with your land available. To also complete the surveys required for this, be that soil surveys, breeding bird surveys, archaeology surveys, or others. And it takes time to do this and get this right. So if you can, start planning as early as you can. If, for example, you're currently within an AIC scheme and your AIC scheme is due for completion at the end of next year, now's the time to start looking at alternatives. It may well be that you consider to go on to the successor scheme for AICs if there is one, and if that suits your needs adequately. Or it may well be you're considering woodland creation for these areas. If so, start early. Woodland creation, like we mentioned, takes time. The demand on the industry at present is at one of the highest levels we have seen in recent years. Both demand for contractors, for tree supply and materials, and on the grants as well, are exceedingly high. The grants are a limited funding pot, so there is a challenge there to secure funding early. Otherwise, you may serve to be disappointed. You may need to push your scheme back into a later year. So plan early, start early, and aim for success. Carbon, and this is the main priority for this presentation. Where does carbon come into all of this within creation? Now, for those of you who've been watching the press this week, you may well have seen the IPCC climate change report that's been released on Tuesday, I believe it was, of this week. Now, this is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and this is the 6th assessment report into climate change. It's been ongoing for a number of years now, but this report is probably the most damning we have seen of yet. And the key statement to take away from this report is the one that's highlighted here in bold. It is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. Widespread and rapid changes in the atmosphere, ocean, cryosphere, and biosphere have already occurred. Essentially, climate change is no longer a concept. We are seeing it happening here and now. It's already happening, it's already here. We are seeing wildfires, we are seeing droughts, we are seeing flooding, we are seeing pests and diseases, and we are seeing temperature and weather changes far outside the normal range for what we've previously experienced. And unless we adapt to those and start planning those into land management for future years, we're going to be caught out. And this forms the basis for carbon credit sales. Now, under the adaptation we have and the desire to improve our environmental sustainability within the UK and the globe as well, there is this move to offset or reduce the amount of carbon we are releasing. The UK signed the climate agreement last year and a number of other obligations as well to reduce their carbon emissions and their greenhouse gas emissions. And we're working towards net zero for 2050. Now, this is one of the goals we're working towards. Previously, there's Kyoto Protocol and there's others out there as well. Carbon credit sales come into this, and what this is essentially is the opportunity for landowners to get financial support from external investors to plant trees on their land, which in return allows investors to make claims regarding the reduction of their net emissions, to claim carbon neutrality, and also to set a pathway to net zero by 2050. A number of companies are now exploring this. There are high-profile companies out there, such as Brewdog, who are in the press on a regular basis working with their carbon neutrality claims. There are also other companies in the background there. But this is growing in profile, and the pace of investment in the sector is accelerating rapidly. We are seeing a huge number of companies now making a move to ESG targets, environmental, social, and governance targets. And this is a move towards reducing emissions, taking more environmental responsibility for your company's management, both for logistics, shipping, business practices, transport. But it's also working to reduce and also improve for the future, for future generations. And carbon credit sales form part of that. In essence, you are leasing your tree's ability to capture carbon to a third party. And that's the long and short of it. The lease schemes that we have, typical contract lengths are quite long. And this is something to bear in mind when you're considering carbon sales. A carbon lease could be 30 to 50 years. It could be, in some of the most extreme cases, 100 years. And we are talking 2, 3, 4 generations worth of land management here. So it is very much a long-term commitment and one to consider carefully to make sure you have all the facts before you commit yourself to this. Carbon credit sales can make small schemes viable for within creation. It can also make larger schemes more economically viable as well. Carbon credit sales have been set up to enable within creation and to support within creation where it otherwise would not have been viable. There are a number of tests we have to pass in order to qualify for carbon credit sales, one of which is legal. the trees being planted cannot form part of a legal obligation that is already on the land. If you have a planning requirement for planting trees, for example, in compensation for a wind farm you've put in, or if you've got part of a planning consent from the council for another development to plant trees, or even if you're looking to restock areas that have already been felled, these areas cannot form part of a carbon credit sale. One of the other key requirements we have to pass here is additionality. When you look to sell carbon on the Woodland Carbon Code, which is the system we use, you have to prove additionality. Essentially, you have to prove that the carbon money you are generating from the scheme is vital for the scheme to go ahead. If your scheme was already generating a surplus and was running to profit, and there were no barriers to its facilitation and delivery prior to carbon investment, you're going to struggle to justify carbon investment for your scheme. The carbon credit sales there are there to make a difference in carbon capture. And if your scheme would go ahead without carbon capture funding, carbon credit funding, it's unlikely to get additional support. Support rates vary. Schemes that deliver more diverse benefits, for example, flood prevention, landscape improvement, biodiversity gains, and also public access, for example, in terms of improving woodlands around towns, are far likely to generate higher values than a single monoculture block of Sitka spruce, for example. And this is something to bear in mind when you design your scheme. One thing that a lot of our landowners are balancing just now is the goal of, do they set a long-term goal for commercial timber production? And with timber values the way they are just now, it's certainly a strong investment to get into. Timber prices are rising. We are seeing prices in excess of £82 per tonne for saw logs from some sites, and higher in other areas. So we are seeing some of the strongest forestry returns that we've seen in a very long time. However, there are other sites that may not suit commercial timber production. These may be sites of a smaller nature that wouldn't be viable for commercial harvesting at later years. They may well have challenging access to them. They may well be on steep terrain that wouldn't suit commercial timber production. Or it may well be that the ground isn't particularly suited to commercial forestry. The soils may not be deep enough. They may not be fertile enough. And as such, the growth rates may not be enough to support a commercial crop. And on these sites, it may well be that native schemes are more viable, or schemes that are specifically designed around carbon capture. And these schemes are where carbon really comes into its own. So the Woodland Carbon Code is the way that we register projects within the UK. The Woodland Carbon Code has been around since 2011, and it's been growing in profile gradually from that point. It has had a slow start. We haven't seen many schemes start in the early years, as it were, and it's only really seen a rapid acceleration from about 2018 onwards. The values we've seen on carbon reflect this. Values in early years were very low. You might be able to generate in early years in the region of £600 to £800 per hectare for carbon schemes. The values that we've seen of recent years have accelerated rapidly beyond this point. The start of this year, we were seeing carbon prices in the region of £6 per tonne of carbon dioxide sequestered. The values that we've seen accelerating to April and beyond, we're now seeing £9 per tonne. And on some limited sites now, with additional benefits there, we're also seeing values in excess of £13 to £16 per tonne. Now, the values I've quoted there are for pending issuance units. And this is one of the key parts of selling carbon. You can sell your carbon up front as a pending issuance unit, and this is essentially a prediction of the amount of carbon your site will sequester over the lifetime of the project. What this means is, before you plant the trees, you register the scheme with the Woodland Carbon Code. You complete a number of tests, including additionality and a cash flow test, and you also complete spreadsheets to calculate the trees that you're planting in terms of the stocking densities and the predicted yields that we're going to generate from these in terms of growth rates. And that will set the amount of carbon that is predicted to be captured for the site for the lifetime of the project. Once you have that figure, it will come out as a tons per hectare figure, sorry, a ton per year figure, and a final value. And this final value can be sold up front as a pending issuance unit. What this means is, the moment your trees are in the ground, you can sell your value as a prediction to a broker or to a third party directly, and you will be paid at that point. And the value that we're seeing, like we mentioned previously, in the region of £9 per tonne, again, this value is rising. What this equates to is an early release of capital for your site. For small schemes, this suddenly makes smaller schemes that were previously uneconomical under the Forestry Grant Scheme, or simply not possible, viable. So we can look now at small shelter belt schemes. We can look at native woodland schemes that would previously be unviable. We can look at remote sites with difficult access. And we can look at any other manner of woodland creation scheme that would previously would have been basically unviable, impossible to deliver without significant costs in previous years. And this is really where the Woodland Carbon Code comes into its own. And this is where it's been set up to support. The pending issuance units you generate will be sold in year 1. There will be a validation process at that stage, and then they'll be verified at year 5, 10, 15, and onwards on a regular interval. Your site will have to be assessed to confirm that it is performing as expected. If your site performs better than expected, you may be able to generate further units. If it doesn't perform as expected, you may not get the full value released at later years. But the value paid up front is a great way to release capital and to make projects viable and possible. The other option to sell Woodland Carbon credits, as it were, is via the Woodland Carbon Unit System, WCU. What this is a verified sequestered unit of carbon. This means that your trees have been growing for a set period of time, normally 15 years or onwards, and that the carbon that we have predicted for them to capture has been delivered. That carbon dioxide ton has been removed from the atmosphere and sequestered within the tree, within the soils, within the foliage. It can be verified and it can be measured on site. And these woodland carbon units, as it were, the verified actual units, are tangible and have a far higher value because they can be used in legal statements regarding the offsetting to reduce your carbon emissions. They can be used on claims to offset current emissions that you've already made. And they can be used towards these net zero statements as well. They have a far higher value than that of the pending issuance units. The value on the market at present is difficult to forecast and express clearly. And this is down to the low volume of woodland carbon units we have in the market at present compared to the number of pending issuance units on the market. The table you'll have at the top of this slide will highlight the difference between pending issuance units and woodland carbon units. Clearly at present, we have approaching 1.5 million pending issuance units in the market, and these are growing by the day as more and more units and schemes join the code. Woodland carbon units, though, are far behind, and this is down to the long-term nature in their production and generation. These are from schemes that have been in the ground for a number of years now and have been measured, verified, and validated. And obviously with 800 available units there compared to 1.3, 1.5 million, there's a significant difference there. Values are significantly higher for woodland carbon units. At present, we see values in the region of £24 per tonne plus. These are again predicted to keep rising as we continue into the future. The table to your left will show the woodland projects on the UK Land Carbon Registry at present, and these are the most recent figures as of the 30th of June of this year. The total number of projects on the scheme are just shy of 1,000 projects. The total number of hectares of woodlands within this scheme, just shy of 40,000 hectares there. And the total number of carbon tons that we are looking at, in terms of million tons of CO2 dioxide equivalent, 13.7. So woodland creation is having a significant impact on carbon offsetting within the UK and farther afield as well. So where does carbon come into this, and prices, and within the woodland creation design? We've already mentioned that carbon makes schemes possible. It is a way to deliver schemes that would otherwise not have been viable. Your scheme in the past may not have been profitable. It may well have been too much of a cost from the outset. It may well have been that the Forestry Grant Scheme, if you've looked at schemes in the past, was going to give you too high a cost at the beginning, and it was going to take too long to recoup those initial costs. And the Carbon Code really delivers on this, carbon credit sales. With the ability you have to release your carbon upfront for a site, you can make these small schemes or complex schemes or expensive schemes viable, and it makes woodland creation possible. We've talked about the diverse range of benefits woodland can offer to you, be it shelter, be it riparian zone planting, be it buffers to prevent runoff from fields, to reduce fertilizer inputs, to reduce wind exposure for livestock or for crops, but also future planning as well for sites. It may well be that you are looking at the current shift in agricultural policy, and with the developments we have down south in England for the elm schemes and future schemes coming through there. And you're looking at these with caution and certainly considering what your property needs to do in the future. Planting trees may well future-proof your farm in this manner. You may well be able to plant property around your farm that was previously underutilized. It may well be that you're planting to divide your farm unit from another business or to separate pastoral systems. Or it may well be you have other objectives from screening, privacy, and also to improve the efficiency of barns and other systems as well. So planting trees is certainly worthwhile, and carbon makes this profitable. The question many people are asking at present is, should we sell carbon? And it's certainly a very big question within the industry, within farming and with forestry as well. Should you sell your carbon? And should you sell your carbon up front, or should you wait for later years and sell with the higher value woodland carbon units? And the answer to this one is that with the number of variables in forestry between projects and between sites and between the landowners involved in the businesses there, it's hard to answer this without knowing specifics. If your scheme is small and unviable using the forestry grant scheme, but it will deliver you enough benefits to make it worthwhile doing, woodland carbon sales may well be vital to make these schemes get off the ground. In which case, for smaller schemes, you may need to sell all your carbon units to make these possible. For larger schemes, it may well be preferable for you to retain some of these units. You may either retain all of the units for later sale or for use to offset your own emissions at later years, or it may be that you sell some of your units up front. So sell enough of the capital from your site to make the woodland creation possible, to release enough of the capital that you have a financial buffer there, that should you need to spend money on, for example, beat up costs or weeding in later years or fence repairs, there is a capital pot available there. But there are also a reserve of carbon units there from your site that you can either use for your own emissions or for selling at a later date at a higher price. And a number of people, a number of investors are looking at this as an option. The question many have is, what lifetime should we look at for these carbon units? Should we sell them for as long as possible, i.e. 100 years to release the maximum value from a site? Or should we sell these for as short as possible, i.e. 30 years or less? And again, this depends on your business model, on what you're looking to achieve. For schemes, this is a long-term commitment. Once you have sold your carbon, it can only be sold once. You cannot double sell your carbon. You cannot buy it back unless in very select circumstances. So if you're looking to commit to sell your carbon, make sure this is the right thing for your business now, but also for the future. Don't sell now and complain about it in a year's time, because there will be issues arising with people selling far more than they should and looking at schemes in the future where carbon could well be vital for future grant schemes. The question many others have is, if you sell the carbon, what do we do with the income generated? And this is a key question as well. If, for example, you are planting 30 hectares of shelter belt around your property, and the forestry grant scheme and carbon mean you are left with a surplus by the end of your planting, you may well have £100,000 of income there that you can use within your farm business. The question many people have is, what do we spend this on? You may look, for example, to look at farm efficiency models, where you are, for example, investing in means to make your farm more efficient with production, i.e. by applying lime to land and improving your yield. You may look at other models where you invest in infrastructure, barns, roads, technology. You may invest in additional land or additional stock, or in the business as a wider unit as well. Or you may well invest these units in terms of the income you generate in carbon units to use now. If you plant a scheme today, the carbon that you generate will unlikely be ready for use for a number of years yet. Trees grow slowly to start with. The real growth time you have for trees and for the carbon units that they produce will not be until 15 to 25 years after planting. If you want to use your units up front to make claims about offsetting your business costs in terms of carbon or other greenhouse gas emissions, you may wish to sell the carbon you produce now, the carbon units, and to use that income to buy other units in the market that are ready for use now. Carbon units at present are treated the same as the commercial occupation of woodlands. Commercial occupation of woodlands are currently not chargeable for income tax or corporation tax, and the value attributable to trees is exempt from capital gain tax. Forestry in the UK is treated very favourably by the tax regime we have at present. This may change in future, and we'd always recommend you speak to an independent financial advisor about specific circumstances before you make any long-term investment decisions. But it's certainly an area worth considering. And back over to you, George.
Thanks very much, Ben. We've got a couple of questions coming in, so I'll just crack on if that's okay with you, Ben.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I think this is quite a common one. How small is too small? You know, I've always thought of the 10 hectare rule as being anything over 10 hectares is viable. Is that still the case, Ben, or are some of these smaller schemes working to change that?
For woodland creation, the threshold we used to have was certainly set by the forestry grant scheme models. Under a certain size, the cost of fencing, the cost of trees, the cost of planting meant that a woodland creation wouldn't be financially viable without significant injection of private capital into the scheme. And that was certainly the case up until a couple of years ago. The change that we have seen now with carbon credits coming into play, but also with these other schemes being taken into account as well, including the Future Woodlands Fund, More Wood scheme for the Woodland Trust, and other investment schemes there as well, means that smaller projects are becoming increasingly viable. I will not put a threshold on in terms of what stage schemes are too small for viability, because every site varies. If you have existing infrastructure in place, i.e. you already have fence blocks, if you have, for example, a riparian zone that is already fenced around a river, it may well be that supplementary planting within this could be far cheaper than a standard woodland creation, shall we say. And as such, I wouldn't discount any woodland creation at present. Even small schemes are now viable, and with the specific schemes such as the Train Hugger grant, which funds purely the trees alone and is not forming part of the forestry grant scheme, it is possible to plant trees now on pretty much any scale. The larger they are, the more viable they are financially in terms of standalone projects. But if they form part of a wider design, for example, and some of my clients will be part of the croft areas, they're submitting applications through other grant schemes and are incorporating tree planting within these as well.
Yeah. Next question, Ben, is I think you've sort of touched on this a bit, but yeah, I suppose we as an industry have a challenge to net zero by 2045, and I think anyone that's sort of read the NFUS roadmap, you know, there's the challenge there is, you know, there's talk of, you know, we're going to need to by 2030, by 2032 come down from 7.5 million tons of CO2 to 5, but by 5 million tons, and you know that's a huge target for us to meet. And I suppose the question is, you know, surely we're going to need some of these woodlands to sequester our own emissions. And you know, what's your sort of thought on that?
So from my view, there is certainly a move within the agricultural policy and within the wider sector as a whole that we may well be looking to offset our own emissions, as it were, on farms in the near future, and not too distant away either. To carry that out, I would certainly look at woodland creation and tree planting trees are likely the cheapest means we have of capturing carbon available. Certainly the trees do this by themselves. They photosynthesize, they will lock up the carbon for a number of years whilst they're growing. And if you're producing, for example, a commercial crop, the timber you produce may well then hold that carbon for a number of years after. If you produce, for example, commercial saw logs, they may well then be used as structural timber and roof joists and beams for timber kit houses or for other construction. And those logs may well then be locking up carbon for another 100 years from the point of harvest. In terms of on a farm level, planting trees, from my point, possibly perhaps biased being a forestry consultant, is always worthwhile. The benefits they can deliver are many and diverse. And to capture your own emission with your own tree planting, it's a fantastic initiative. With the rising cost of carbon on the market and the changes we've seen from even 2 years ago when we were seeing £1.50 per tonne of carbon dioxide sequestered to values of £9 a tonne we were seeing at the start of this year, the price of carbon is increasing rapidly. And if you can plan for that early and make arrangements early, you can potentially avoid prices being far higher in the future when you may need to sequester your own emissions at that stage. In terms of what to do on a farm basis, it may well be that you plant trees now, register your carbon units, and the key point in this is to register your carbon units before you plant. Once your trees are in the ground, it is too late to register for the Woodland Carbon Code. And this rules out, unfortunately, any existing trees you may have on your land and any trees that were planted prior to registration with the Woodland Carbon Code. And this change was as of summer of this year. So definitely register them early. And in terms of business efficiency for carbon, make the changes you can now to increase your yields and increase your efficiencies. Capturing carbon is one side, but reducing your emission is the other. And one is far quicker to do than the other.
Yeah. So I think the key message there then, Ben, is if you're thinking about establishing new woodlands on the farm, whether that be shelter belts or marginal areas of unproductive ground, then you've nothing to lose by registering. Would that be fair?
Absolutely. For a lot of the areas we're planting on now, these are areas that were undermanaged. They were areas that had been allowed to go to fallow. They may well have been difficult to access, difficult to manage, and that may well be down to terrain. It may well be down to the isolated nature of some of the blocks. It may well be that you hold a field that is now surrounded by other landowners. So moving stock into it is challenging. It may well be that your fields have been broken up by subsequent infrastructure, such as road installation, power line way leaves, and others. Or it may well be that they were never particularly productive to start with. It may be that you have fields that are particularly wet, they have areas of rushes within them, areas of gorse or bracken, and it's a constant battle to keep these areas under control and in production. And sometimes the easiest thing to do with these, and the most logical thing to do with them, is instead of throwing good money after bad, turn these areas across to woodland. Diversify your farm business, invest in trees, and the trees will generate their own income as well as the benefits around them.
Yeah, just another question there, Ben, just sticking on the carbon contract that you enter into. What happens if the land is sold in the future? You know, obviously some of these contracts you were talking, you know, 50, could be 50 to 100 years old. What's the sort of process there?
So the process in terms of land sale with a carbon obligation on the land varies depending on the contract that you take out. There are a number of parties out there who are buying and selling carbon, some which are brokers, some which are third parties, some people are buying direct. There are investment in this industry from a huge number of companies and people. It may well be that you are offering woodlands that are being invested in by Waitrose, Sainsbury's, BP, Shell, Esso, Heathrow. Any number of businesses are looking to offset their carbon emissions, and they do this either directly with larger landowners, or smaller landowners may well go via a broker. And there's a number of these available, a list of which is available on the Woodland Carbon Code website. In terms of what happens when the land is sold in the future, it may well be that the contract you enter into has a clause there that requires the carbon contract to be continued with the next land purchase. So the next landowner may well have to continue meeting the obligations that are set out in this contract. If this isn't favorable for them, it may well be that you have to, either you or the seller, as it were, at that stage, has to pay back some or all of the carbon value released at that early stage. Or it may well be that you look to buy units from elsewhere in the market to offset any remaining obligation on the site. Individual contracts vary, they're all different. I would certainly recommend reading the small print though before entering into any of these clauses. As we mentioned, these are long-term contracts, 40, 50 years and beyond. Do not take into them lightly.
Yeah, and as you mentioned before, you're entering into contracts from by many different brokers or companies looking to trade with you. So every contract is going to be slightly different. Every
contract will be different. Every price may well be different as well.
Yeah.
Depending on who is buying, they may offer a higher price than others. Schemes that we have just now, in terms of woodland creation schemes, the value on carbon on them does vary. And this varies depending on, a lot of the times, public perception and social value of carbon. As we mentioned previously, if your site has a diverse number of benefits, if it delivers flood prevention, soil erosion prevention, if it provides habitat for endangered species, for example, if you are expanding native woodland habitats that already exist on the property, if you're planting in target areas, natural parks, areas of outstanding natural beauty, you may well see that carbon values you are offered are far higher. The value of UK carbon credits seems to be higher than some of those in other parts of the developing world. And this may well be down to the fact it is a tangible asset that can be seen within the UK. It can be promoted by UK businesses that they are investing within the UK boundary, as it were, and they're not investing in projects overseas. It may well be that your investor in the carbon may want to put, for example, a sign on the property showing that they have invested. This is the scheme that they are supporting. Some schemes and some investors actively come out to the site themselves as well. They may hold a staff or public engagement day on the land that they have planted with the funding that they have generated. And this is normally agreed in advance to the landowner, and it's certainly something I wouldn't shy away from. It's a fantastic opportunity to promote business and to promote networks as well.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. Got another question here. It's about clearfell. We have an area of ground that was clearfelled a couple of years ago. Is it possible to register this type of ground?
So this falls unfortunately within one of the tests we have to pass for the Woodland Carbon Code. And the test I'm referring to is legal. Because the area was clearfelled a couple of years ago, it's an area that will have an existing restock obligation on it. And that will be under the felling license that the trees were cut under. If you have an area of land that was previously within trees, and by previously I mean any time in the past 25 years under tree cover, it's unlikely to be eligible for Woodland Carbon Code. And this is because the code is established and set up to support new woodland creation only. Unfortunately, if you are restocking an area, if you're planting an area that was previously clearfelled even 25 years ago, it may well not pass the test for additionality. Now, that's not to be said that you cannot do a woodland creation scheme with the carbon code on it, but it may well be that you need to do this in addition to the area that's been clearfelled. Some of the schemes we're doing now incorporate clearfelled areas within them. So it may well be the clearfelled area forms a part of the greater design, but the woodland creation and the carbon credit sale, as it were, is for an area of woodland either adjoining or extending around the area that was clearfelled. And this is certainly something I'd recommend to those looking to restock at the present time as a way to subsidize the cost of restocking, but also to expand your woodland creation options.
Yeah. What advice would you give, Ben, to anyone that is thinking about woodland on their farm, but aren't sure of what options might suit?
So for anyone looking to explore woodland creation, but not entirely certain about where to go with this, there is a wealth of information on the Farm Advisory Service website. There are advice publications, webinars, and podcasts there detailing most, if not all, aspects of woodland management, woodland creation, woodland maintenance, and the design of woodland creation as well. On top of that, there is also the Farm Advisory Services Specialist Advice Plans. And this is an opportunity for landowners who are registered as an agricultural business in Scotland to apply for grant funding up to £1,000 at 100% grant funding rate to get a forestry specialist advisor to look at their properties and either advise on existing woodland management or potentially on the creation of new woodlands as well. And this is a great way to explore whether a site would lend itself to woodland creation, where these trees would fit within the property, and also what sorts of income and costs might be generated from these projects without a significant cost to explore them from the beginning.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ben. Just keep going with the questions here because we've got a couple of minutes. So
no problem at all.
If we don't get them all answered, we'll obviously get them answered and send them around in the summary after the meeting. So next question, what happens? This goes back to the carbon contract side of it. What happens if the carbon produced doesn't meet the predictions? So by that, what happens if the carbon sequestered doesn't meet the predictions of the contract?
So when we carry out carbon predictions for a site for woodland creation, we use spreadsheets and models that are laid out under the Woodland Carbon Code. These already have an inherent level of risk management built into them. So the carbon forecast, as it were, is based on very much cautious yields and approaches to carbon sequestration. As such, it means that the carbon predicted may well be less than would be likely delivered by the site. On top of this, when you register with the Woodland Carbon Code, there is a carbon buffer that is applied to every project. And what this does is essentially, you will only ever be able to sell 80% of the predicted carbon units from your site. You will never be able to sell 100% of your site carbon under the current code guidelines. And what this does is it builds in a level of almost insurance into the Woodland Carbon Code that should projects not perform as predicted, or should they fall foul of pests, diseases, climate change, or for example, wildfire or wind blow, that there is that element of insurance and risk management within the design there. The carbon contracts you enter into, I would pay close attention to any clauses you have there in terms of if the scheme should not perform as predicted. I would certainly advise insuring your scheme against loss, and this is something we'd always recommend for any new woodland creation. The costs are expensive to plant new woodland creations, the cost to maintain them as well, and to have this investment lost down to wildfire in future years, I would recommend for insuring against loss. Some insurers are now also offering insurance for carbon credits as well, and this is on this basis of schemes not performing as desired or as predicted.
Okay, thanks, Ben. Next question.
George.
Oh, we've got a question there, Jennifer. Yeah, go on ahead.
Okay, sorry, I can't work out how to type at the same time as watching it.
Grand.
I've got two questions. The first one is with regard to, let's say you plant 10 hectares on one of the one of the types of trees. Mm-hmm. Can you, for example, then sell or do the pending issuance part for, say, half of that, and then retain the rest for the units, the verified units later on? And could you, with that bit you've retained, half of it keep for your own use to offset your own carbon in the future, and half of it sell for the high carbon price after 15 or 25 years? Am I understanding this correct? Is that something you could think about doing, splitting it in that way?
It is. This is something that's developing within the market just now. Previously, it was a case of almost all or nothing, as it were, in terms of sell upfront or sell at a later stage as within carbon units. What we are increasingly seeing happening now is people selling some of the units upfront to release some of the initial capital and pay for the any shortcomings, for example, in the forestry grant scheme that don't cover the full cost of the site.
Yeah.
Also release some of the money there to allow an early investment in other schemes or in other areas. But we're seeing a lot of landowners as well retaining those units either for their own use or for selling at a later stage as within carbon units at a higher value. I would say for that, you will need to register these early.
Yeah.
Registering the carbon units can be done by yourself directly through the Woodland Carbon Code. It can be done by an agent for you, or it can be done by a broker as well, a third party. But the key point on this is to register them prior to planting. Once your trees are going in the ground, it is too late. Register them early or you may miss out, unfortunately.
Great, that's great, thank you. And my second question is not related, it's a different area. You're talking about the brokers and agents and different businesses that you can sell your carbon units via. Are these regulated in some way? Or is every Tom, Dick and Harry setting themselves up as an agent, or is there a way we can know we're selling through a legal person?
Yes. So in terms of accreditation for selling carbon units, the method we have within the Woodland Carbon Code is the gold standard in the UK, as it were.
Okay.
The Woodland Carbon Code is the scheme that forestry schemes have to abide by within the UK. And it's been set up to have that level of transparency there, the legal backing, and it also applies for a number of ISO and BS standards, as well as international standards as well. And the Woodland Carbon Code is key for ensuring that the projects registered through it in the UK are additional, they are legal, and they are delivering the benefits that they describe. The challenge we see at present is that there are landowners and there are investors, as it were, buying and selling units outside of the Woodland Carbon Code. And this is more applicable to the developments we've seen recently in regenerative agriculture and in soil carbon. At present, these areas don't have the same level of regulation and protection as the Woodland Carbon Code areas do. And this is more where we can see potentially, for example, double accounting for units. It may well be that we're seeing schemes advertising far more sequestration rates than they're achieving. And it may well be that they are selling units more than once. The Woodland Carbon Code makes sure that these units are tangible, they are delivered, they are legal. And it's essentially the administrator for the IHS carbon registry, the carbon market. In terms of brokers and agents, there are a number of forestry agents and agricultural agents out there who can help you with your woodland creation. In terms of carbon agents, there are also a number of these. Some of them are the same party for doing the woodland creation process itself. Some of them are specialists that deal with brokering carbon directly. A list of these can be found within the Woodland Carbon Code website. More detailed contact details there. You'll also see within there a list of the existing projects already there and the number of projects registered against each party. So you can see, for example, if some of the companies there have registered 500,000 tons of carbon, or if they've only registered 5. We'll not name specific names in terms of individual parties to go with, but there are brokers within there who come very highly recommended and who have been integral to the Woodland Carbon Code since its inception, since 2011.
Thank you very much.
No problem at all.
Okay, I'm just conscious of time here. We've got quite a few questions here, but I'm gonna I'll get them all answered, and I'll send round all the answers after the meeting, and I'll include any links to any of the content that we talked about today. I'm just conscious of time, so I'll make sure to get that done. So Ben, I'm just gonna put you on the spot here for a wee minute, and just so could you just give us your key points, or maybe you've got 3 key points just that we can take away from this meeting? What are your 3, we'll call it 3 top tips?
Absolutely. So
Yeah.
Woodland creation for farms. Trees are a fantastic investment, both financially and for a wider farm business in terms of the diverse benefits they can offer. But you need to plan early and you need to plant early. They take a long time to grow. The schemes take a long time to develop in terms of getting them through to approval. So start as early as you can looking at these areas if you have areas set aside or if you want to explore this option. Number 2, the Woodland Carbon Code, as it were, registering trees and planting them. Register your projects prior to planting. I will keep stressing this point. With the change we have had in the Carbon Code and its criteria, register your carbon before you plant it, even if you don't know if you're going to sell it up front as a penning issuance unit, or later down the line as a Woodland carbon unit, or potentially use it for your own offsetting. Make that step early and register it at point before you deliver your project, in terms of before the trees start growing in the ground. Because after you start getting the trees in the ground, it's too late. And finally, for carbon and for woodland creation in general, you're entering into a long-term commitment. It is a land use change. So the area you put into forestry will be in forestry for perpetuity. You will not be able to bring it back into agriculture. So plan these areas into your business model and your land use and your management policy early, and do so in such a way that you're looking 20, 40 years down the line. Do not plant trees where you're going to be needing road access, where you are going to have way leaves coming through, where you're going to be building new barns, because you're setting yourself up for problems down the line. When you put your trees in, make sure you know every step of your contract, both with the forestry grant scheme and with the carbon credits scheme and any other schemes there as well. And I'll finish finally on the grant support and the available support for woodland creation at present. The forestry grant scheme we have is a very generous scheme. It is very heavily competed for though as well. There are a lot of applicants. There is a limited pot of money, so apply early. The grant scheme can be used with other sources of funding. So if you're looking at a woodland creation just now, it is completely possible for you to use the forestry grant scheme with the capital items to build new fences and gates around your land to remove gorse, bracken, and to plant your trees there and get 5 years of maintenance on the area you plant. It's also possible then to use carbon credits to either release value up front and release a large capital sum, or gradually over the years as your units become available. And it's also possible to retain BPS payments, basic farm payments as well, on the area that you plant under a forestry grant scheme. And these can be eligible for the lifetime of the contract, i.e. 20 years, or until the BPS system ends, whichever comes sooner.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Ben. That's great. And I'll just stress your point from earlier. It's the right trees in the right places. Also,
absolutely. It's the mantra you'll see coming through from Scottish Forestry everywhere, and in all woodland publications, the right tree in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, and in the right place can form an integrated approach to your existing farming policy.
Absolutely.
So no, that's been great, Ben. Thank you for a great summary there. And I'll just, I hope that wasn't too stressful for you.
No problem at all. Hopefully we've answered most of the questions we've had today. I'll add if there are any further questions, if anyone attending today wants to explore tree planting further, please feel free to get in touch. We'd be happy to answer questions. And the fast inquiry line as well is a fantastic source of further information.
I'll just quickly pick up on Ben's point from earlier as well. If anyone is interested in forestry but not sure where to go or where to start, there is funding, £1,000 funding available to look at a woodland specialist plan for your own farm. There's also, which can be used as a standalone or with an ILMP. So the ILMP part is for addressing any changes to farming policy or any sort of improvements that you're thinking of making with the farm, whereas the specialist plan can be completely related to the forestry side of things. There's also, as Ben said, a huge range of information out there on the Farm Advisory Service website, including a really good podcast that I quite like. It's frequently asked questions to forestry consultants and foresters. So check that out along with a whole other range of material there. So I think we'll just finish it there, and I'd just like to thank all of you guys for taking the time out of your afternoon to join us. So thanks again.